The chair scraped back so hard it nearly knocked Roy Ralston off his feet. He stood in the doorway of the Dusty Creek Saloon's back dining room, lantern light catching the wild grief in his eyes, and he stared at the empty seat at the far end of the table like it had personally wronged him. His daughter Clara, 9 years old and solemn as a preacher's shadow, had done it again. She had pulled that chair out from the table before supper was even set, smoothed the worn cushion with her small palms, and left it empty as she climbed into her own seat beside it. She folded her hands. She bowed her head. She waited. Roy crossed the room in 3 strides. "Clara." She looked up at him with eyes the color of storm clouds over a mesa. "Clara, I told you to stop doing that." "She might come back," Clara said simply, as though that settled everything. Roy pressed his knuckles against the edge of the table so hard the wood groaned. His jaw was tight enough to crack. Behind him, old Me from the kitchen doorway watched with a dish towel twisted in her hands, and she had the decency not to speak. The whole room felt like it was holding its breath, the candles barely flickering, the tin plates unmoving. "She is not coming back," Roy said, and his voice broke on the last word in a way he had not let it break in front of anyone in over 4 months. "She is never coming back, sweetheart. We have been through this." Clara looked at the empty chair and then back at her father and said, calm as still water, "But what if she does? Then she would not have a place." Something inside Roy Ralston cracked clean down the middle right there, in that overheated back room with supper going cold and the whole ugly weight of grief sitting right there at his table like an uninvited guest. He pulled out the chair beside Clara's own seat, sat down, buried his face in his hands, and for one long, terrible moment he did not move. Because the truth was worse than Clara knew. The truth was that the chair had nothing to do with Roy's dead wife. Clara had begun leaving that seat empty 6 weeks ago. Right around the time, a woman named Maggie Norris had started coming through the door of the Dusty Creek Saloon dining room every Tuesday and Thursday evening for her supper. And Roy Ralston, God help him, had noticed every single time. It was the autumn of 1882 in the territory of New Mexico, and the town of Dusty Creek sat like a dried-out seed pod in the middle of a flat brown world, too stubborn to blow away and too tired to thrive. It was a railroad town in ambition and a cattle town in practice, and it smelled of horse and dust and wood smoke, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from too many hard-working people, all keeping their secrets nailed down tight. Roy Ralston had come to Dusty Creek 3 years prior with nothing but a $160 claim on a modest cattle spread north of town, a talent for fixing broken things, and a grief that he wore like a second coat. His wife Ellen had died of typhoid fever in the spring of 1880, leaving him with a 5-year-old girl who had inherited Ellen's gray eyes and stubborn mouth, and leaving Roy with the kind of dark past that a man either drinks himself through or works himself through. Roy chose work. He built a cattle operation from 40 heads to 300 in 2 years, bought the grazing rights to a pretty stretch of land along the creek, and hired himself 2 reliable ranch hands named Dolan and Perfecto. He did not court. He did not dance. He did not permit himself to feel much of anything beyond the quiet satisfaction of seeing Clara fed and clean and read to every night before bed. Then Maggie Norris walked into Dusty Creek on a September afternoon in 1882 with a carpetbag in one hand and a letter of employment in the other, and Roy's careful order of things quietly began to shake. Maggie Norris was 27 years old, and she had the kind of face that did not ask you to look at it, but made it impossible not to. High cheekbones browned from sun, dark hair pinned back in a way that was always slightly coming undone on one side, eyes that were an unusual amber color, the color of old whiskey or new honey depending on the light. She walked like a woman who had learned to take up exactly the space she needed, and not 1 inch more, which was the posture of someone who had spent considerable time in places where too much presence was punished. She had been hired by Clement Walsh, who owned the Dusty Creek Mercantile, and also ran a small school out of his back building 3 days a week to teach the dozen or so children in town who were old enough to sit at a desk. Walsh had advertised in the Santa Fe papers and Maggie had answered, and she had arrived on a Tuesday with her carpetbag and her letter, and a composure that suggested she had survived worse arrivals than this one. The deal Walsh offered her included room and board at the boarding house owned by Miss Sutton, who was also the woman who ran the kitchen at the saloon's dining room because Dusty Creek was the kind of small town where everyone wore 3 or 4 hats simultaneously. Me had a round face and quick dark eyes, and a habit of feeding people she liked extra corn bread, which told you everything you needed to know about her character. Maggie's first Tuesday evening in Dusty Creek, she had gone to Me's dining room because Me's boarding house did not have a separate kitchen for guests, and that was where she had eaten her first supper in her new town. She had sat at the long community table, the only one where single women were permitted to eat on their own without raising eyebrows, and she had ordered the rabbit stew and eaten it without complaint even though it was slightly oversalted, and she had not bothered anyone and no one had bothered her. Roy had been there that night with Clara because Clara had begged him for supper out as a birthday treat. He had barely registered the new woman at the other end of the table. He was busy cutting Clara's meat and explaining for the 14th time why she could not have pie before supper, but Clara had noticed Maggie. Clara had stared at her across the length of the table with the focused intensity of a child who has decided something, and when they were walking home that night she had pulled Roy's hand and said, "Papa, who is the woman with the amber eyes?" "I did not pay attention," Roy said. "She is very pretty," Clara said. "She was eating by herself." "Lots of people eat by themselves," Roy said. "She looked like she did not mind," Clara said thoughtfully. "But I think she did mind just a little." Roy had not known what to say to that. Clara had a way of seeing things that made him feel both proud and slightly unnerved. Maggie began school on a Wednesday morning with 8 students, and by Thursday she had added 3 more because word traveled fast in Dusty Creek that the new teacher was both strict and fair, which was a rarer combination than people acknowledged. She taught reading from McGuffey readers, arithmetic from a slate board, and geography from a single large map she had brought herself in a tube case and pinned to the wall with brass tacks. Clara was among her students from the very first day, and Clara, who had her father's stubborn streak wrapped inside her mother's quiet grace, decided within the first morning that Miss Norris was the finest person she had ever encountered. This decision was not made lightly. Clara was not a child who handed out admiration freely. She had spent 3 years watching her father rebuild their world with his bare hands, and had learned from him that things worth having required careful assessment. She watched Maggie explain long division with the same patient intensity she gave to everything, and she watched how Maggie did not talk down to any of them, and she watched how when Tommy Reeves, who was slow with his letters through no fault of his own, struggled over a word, Maggie did not sigh or look away, but simply leaned in and waited with the kind of genuine patience that cannot be faked. Clara went home that first Thursday evening and set the table for supper and pulled out the chair beside her own and smoothed the cushion. Roy, who was washing his hands at the basin, said, "Who is that for?" Clara said, "Miss Norris." Roy dried his hands very slowly. "Miss Norris is not coming to supper." "I know," Clara said, "but she should have a place." Roy had assumed it was a child's fancy that would pass in a day or two. He had not understood yet that his daughter was conducting what could only be described as a campaign. The second Tuesday, Maggie came into Me's dining room and Clara happened to be there again, because Roy had stayed in town late for a meeting with the land office and had brought Clara along. And this time Clara had looked up from her corn bread and said, quite calmly, to the woman settling herself alone at the far end of the table, "Miss Norris, you can sit here if you like." Maggie looked down the table and looked at the small, serious girl and said, "Thank you, Clara. That is very kind." "My papa will not mind," Clara said. Roy nearly choked on his coffee. Maggie's amber eyes moved from Clara to Roy, and she did something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to it to make his ears go warm. She gathered her plate and her glass, and she walked the length of the table and sat down across from Roy Ralston for the first time. And he did not know then that nothing in his carefully organized, grief-hardened life was going to be the same afterward. "Mr. Ralston," she said. "Miss Norris," he said. Clara watched both of them with those storm cloud eyes and put a piece of corn bread in her mouth with the satisfied air of a general who has successfully maneuvered her troops. Conversation that first shared supper was stilted and cautious. Roy Ralston was not a man who was comfortable with small talk in the best of circumstances, and Maggie Norris had a way of listening so carefully that it made a person want to choose their words more deliberately, which in Roy's case translated to choosing very few of them. He asked about the school. She answered. She asked about the ranch. He answered. Clara filled in the silences with a running commentary on her lessons that kept the whole thing from becoming painful, but something had shifted. Roy noticed it walking home that night with Clara's hand in his. There was a warmth in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time, and he was immediately suspicious of it. He had learned through hard experience that warmth in his chest usually preceded something that required sacrifice or pain or both. He told himself it was nothing, a pleasant meal, a polite woman. He believed himself for approximately 4 days. It was a Friday morning when Roy came into town for supplies and stopped by Walsh's Mercantile for 100 weight of flour and a new lantern glass. And as he was loading the wagon, Maggie came out of the school building next door carrying a stack of slates that was obviously too heavy for one person. He watched her manage the bottom step with the particular fierce independence of someone who refuses to ask for help, and he lasted about 7 seconds before he crossed the street. "Let me take some of those," he said. She looked at him over the top of the stack. "I have them." "I can see that," he said, "but you are listing to the left." A pause. Then she allowed him to take half the stack. They carried them inside together, into the cool, dim interior of the school room with its 4 rows of desks and its big map on the wall, and Roy set his half down on the front table and looked around the room with genuine interest. "She talks about this place every supper," he said. "Clara is an exceptional student," Maggie said, and there was warmth in her voice that was entirely genuine, not the performed warmth of someone trying to flatter a parent. "She has a mathematical mind and a reader's heart, which is a rare combination." Roy looked at her. That is exactly what her mother was. The words came out before he had planned them, and he saw Maggie absorb them carefully, the way she absorbed everything. "I am sorry about your wife," she said. "Me told me." "I hope that is not intrusive of her to have mentioned it." "No," Roy said. "Me tells everyone everything. It is her main contribution to civic life." Maggie laughed. It was a real laugh, brief and genuine, and it did something to the air in the room that Roy noticed and noted, and did not examine too closely. He left shortly after and drove his wagon back toward the ranch with the flour and the lantern glass, and he was halfway there before he realized that he had spent 40 minutes in that schoolroom without once noticing the passage of time. The Tuesdays and Thursdays became the organizing principle of the week. Not because Roy intended them to, but because Clara always remembered, and Clara always found some reason why supper at Me's dining room was the natural choice those particular evenings. And Roy was many things, but he was not a man who denied his daughter her small pleasures. Clara would sit down, smooth the cushion of that empty chair, and wait. And within 15 or 20 minutes Maggie would arrive, and Clara would light up like a match struck in the dark, and Maggie would sit down in the chair that had been waiting for her, and supper would commence. Roy told himself each time that he was simply being civil. He told himself that it was good for Clara to have a female presence. He told himself that Maggie Norris was his daughter's teacher, and he was being a responsible father by maintaining a cordial relationship with her. He also told himself that the reason he had started changing his shirt before heading into town on those evenings had nothing to do with anything in particular. But the truth was building up inside him, the way water builds behind a dam, and Roy Ralston had spent enough years working with livestock and weather and land to know that pressure of that kind eventually finds its way out. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the form of Edmund Price. Edmund Price was 35, the son of a land-speculating family out of Albuquerque, and he had arrived in Dusty Creek in late October of 1882 to look into buying up water rights along the creek. He was the kind of handsome that announces itself upon entering a room, tall with a dark mustache and easy manners and clothing that was not flashy, but was clearly more expensive than the average Dusty Creek resident could afford. He had money, and he knew how to wear it without seeming to try. He also noticed Maggie Norris within 2 days of arriving, which was not surprising because Maggie was the kind of woman who became noticeable the more you were around her, and Price was the kind of man who cataloged attractive women as a matter of habit. Roy found out about Price's interest through the least surprising channel possible, which was Miss Sutton, who mentioned it to him on a Wednesday morning when he came in to settle his dining account. "That speculator has asked after Miss Norris twice," Mee said, wiping the counter with unnecessary energy. "Asked Walsh about her background, asked me whether she has any particular male friends." Roy kept his face very still. "Is that so?" "I told him she keeps to herself," Mee said, "which is the truth, but I thought you might like to know." Roy had no particular right to feel the thing he felt in that moment, which was a cold, gripping, unreasonable possessiveness that horrified him when he recognized it for what it was. He had never once told Maggie Norris that he thought about her between Tuesday and Thursday. He had never told her that he had started waking up earlier to get his morning work done, so that he would have fewer excuses to miss those suppers. He had never told her anything at all that could be described as romantic or forward or even particularly personal. He went home and spent 2 days being curt and preoccupied and largely useless, and Clara watched him with those knowing eyes and said nothing, which was its own kind of commentary. The following Tuesday Price appeared at Me's dining room, which was a public establishment and therefore could not exclude him, and he sat himself down at the community table 3 seats from Maggie with the confidence of a man who does not anticipate rejection, and he introduced himself with great charm, and Roy Ralston sat across from all of it and felt every muscle in his body go rigid. Maggie was perfectly polite to Price. She was perfectly polite to everyone. It was one of the things Roy had noticed about her, that she maintained a consistent warmth without granting any one particular access, and he had spent a considerable amount of time wondering whether the conversations they had at supper constituted access or simply represented her general professional pleasantness. Watching her be pleasant to Edmund Price did not help answer that question. Clara, who had apparently assessed the situation in the time it takes to blink, leaned over to Maggie and said in a voice perfectly calibrated to reach Roy's ears, "Miss Norris, Papa says you are the finest teacher in the whole of New Mexico." Roy had said no such thing, at least not in those exact words. Maggie's amber eyes came to him across the table with an expression he could not read, and he held her gaze for 3 seconds before she said, "Your father is very kind." Price looked between them with a quick, assessing intelligence that Roy recognized and disliked. He had known men like Price before, men who read a room fast and adjusted their approach accordingly, and the adjustment Roy saw happening in Price's expression was not a retreat but a sharpening, which was worse. After supper, Roy walked Clara out and stood on the boardwalk in the cold October air and buckled her coat, and when he straightened up Maggie was behind him. "Good evening, Mr. Ralston," she said. "Miss Norris." He turned. She was standing in the warm light from the saloon window with her coat on and her hat in her hands because she had not put it on yet, and her dark hair was doing that thing it always did where one piece had escaped on the left side and curled against her jaw. "Are you all right?" she said. "You seemed quiet tonight." "I am always quiet," he said. "Quieter than usual then," she said. Clara had taken his hand and was swinging it gently back and forth with the patient persistence of a child who wants to leave, but has decided not to rush her father. Roy looked at Maggie, and he thought about the chair. He thought about how Clara had told him 3 nights ago that she kept that chair empty because she was saving it for someone important, and how he had pretended not to understand what she meant. He thought about how the whole dangerous, impossible weight of his feelings had been building for 2 months, and how he had nowhere to put them, and how there was a man inside that dining room right now with easy manners and money and no dead wife and no little girl and no complicated grief, and how Maggie Norris deserved that kind of uncomplicated thing, probably. "I am fine," he said. "Good night, Miss Norris." He walked Clara home in the dark and read her 2 chapters of a book about a boy and his horse, and stayed in her room until she was asleep, and then he went and sat in his kitchen with a glass of water. He did not drink and stared at the empty chair at the end of his table and felt the trap of his own making close around him. The situation with Price did not resolve itself. He came to me's dining room 4 of the next 6 evenings, which was so obviously a campaign that me had started raising her eyebrow every time he walked in. He was also spending considerable time at the Mercantile, purchasing things with suspicious frequency, and Walsh later reported to Roy with apologetic casualness that Price had asked Maggie if she would like to attend the harvest social at the end of October. Roy heard this and went back to his ranch and spent a whole afternoon fixing a fence that did not need to be fixed. He was not a man who had ever been comfortable with uncertainty. In his cattle operation, every problem had a solution and every solution had an action, and he was good at taking action. But with Maggie Norris, he did not know what action to take because he was terrified that the action he wanted to take would be wrong. He had Clara to consider. Clara, who had made herself a little lighthouse with that empty chair, sending a signal he could see but had not yet been willing to sail toward. It was November now and the air had teeth in the morning, and Roy was coming back from a hard day of gathering late-season strays when Dahlin, his senior ranch hand, intercepted him at the gate. "Roy," Dahlin said, "someone came out here today looking for you." Roy tied his horse. "Who?" "Woman named Norris," Dahlin said without inflection. "Your daughter's teacher." Roy went very still. "What did she want?" "Did not say, left this." Dahlin produced a folded piece of paper. Roy took it inside and unfolded it at his kitchen table. The handwriting was clear and even the handwriting of a teacher, and it said, "Mr. Ralston, I wonder if you might have a few minutes on Friday morning. I would like to speak with you about something concerning Clara, nothing alarming. I would not want to wait until our next shared supper for privacy's sake. Maggie Norris." He read it twice and then a third time, focusing each time on the word privacy. She had specifically said that she did not want to wait for a shared supper because she wanted privacy, which meant that whatever she wanted to say, she did not want to say in front of other people. He spent Thursday in a state that his ranch hands later politely described as distracted, and that was more accurately described as a man conducting an internal argument with himself at high volume. He had no idea what she meant to say to him. He could construct 3 or 4 possible conversations, and each one seemed equally plausible and equally terrifying. He arrived at the schoolroom on Friday morning 20 minutes before Walsh's Mercantile opened, which meant the street was still largely empty, and he knocked at the school door and heard her say come in from inside. She was at the front table organizing her slates, and she looked up when he came in with the careful, composed expression she used when she was marshaling herself, and he recognized it now because he had watched her face long enough to know its different registers. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Please sit." He sat at one of the larger student desks, which he was too big for, and she came and sat at the desk across from it so that they were level with each other rather than her standing above him, and he noticed that and thought it was a deliberate choice that told you something about her character. "I wanted to speak with you about Clara," she said. "Not because anything is wrong." She is wonderful, but I want to tell you something she has been doing in school that I thought you should know about." Roy kept his expression neutral. "All right. She has been writing you a letter," Maggie said. "Over the past 3 weeks in her composition time, instead of the assigned topics, she has been writing you a letter. I allowed it because the quality of the writing was excellent and I did not want to discourage it, and also because the content seemed to me to be genuinely important." She paused. "She let me read it. She asked for my help with some of the spelling, and then she asked me to decide whether to give it to you." Roy's hands were flat on the small desk. "What does it say?" Maggie looked at him steadily. "She says that she knows you are sad without her mother, and that she is sad without her mother too, but that she thinks you are afraid to let anyone help, and that she wants you to be happy, and that she thinks you could be happy, and that she believes Miss Norris would be good for you if you would stop being so stubborn and just talk to her." The room was completely silent. Roy looked at the map on the wall for a moment because he needed to look at something that was not Maggie Norris's face. "She used the word stubborn," he said. "Twice," Maggie said. He brought his eyes back to her. The amber light in her eyes was very steady and she was not moving, not leaning toward him or away from him, just waiting the way she always waited with that extraordinary patience. "Miss Norris," he said, "I need to ask you something directly." "Please do," she said. "The speculator, Price," he said it carefully. "Has he made you an offer of courtship?" Something moved across her face. It was not amusement exactly, but it was in that neighborhood. "He has expressed interest," she said. And I told him that I was not interested in being courted by a man who plans to leave town in February," she said. Roy processed that. "He is leaving in February." "He told me so himself, actually, which I thought showed either honesty or remarkable overconfidence," she said. "He is here for the water rights deal and then he is going back to Albuquerque." "And you knew that before you refused him," Roy said. "Yes," she said. "Would you have refused him anyway," Roy said, "if he were staying?" She looked at him for a moment that lasted long enough for his heart to do something complicated. "Yes," she said, "I would have." The air in the schoolroom changed. Roy pushed back from the small desk and stood up, because he was too large to have this conversation while folded into a child's chair. And then he was standing and she rose too, and they were facing each other across 3 feet of scrubbed wooden floor. "I have a daughter," he said. "She is 9 years old and she lost her mother and she has very strong opinions." "I am aware," Maggie said. "And I have a ranch that takes 12 hours a day," he said. "And I am not always easy company. I know that about myself." "You are perfectly good company," she said quietly. "You listen. That is rarer than you might think." He took one step toward her and stopped. He had to be careful. Not for his sake, but for hers. He had a dark past of grief that he was not entirely sure he had finished mourning. He had a child who had already decided everything and whose heart would be involved whether he was careful or not. He had to be honest about all of it. "I need you to know," he said, "that whatever this is, I am not interested in being casual about it. I am too old for casual and I have too much to lose." "I am not interested in casual either," she said. "I have never been good at it." "Then I would like," he said, choosing each word like a man stepping carefully across a fast-running creek, "to court you properly, if that is something you would consider." Maggie Norris took a breath and let it out. And then she did smile, a full one this time, and it rearranged his understanding of what the word beautiful meant. "I would consider it," she said. "Yes." He walked back to his horse with his hat in his hands and stood for a moment in the cold November air feeling slightly stunned, the way a man feels when a thing he wanted so badly he had stopped believing in it suddenly turns out to be true. He did not have a ring. He did not have a plan. He had a 9-year-old daughter who had written her teacher a 3-week letter telling her to marry her father, and a chair that had been kept empty every night for 6 weeks. He thought that was probably a solid enough foundation. The courtship proceeded with the particular careful formality of 2 people who both had excellent reasons to take things slowly, and an equally excellent inability to actually do so. Roy called at the boarding house on Saturday afternoons, which Miss Sutton found delightful and made no secret of, bringing out her good china for tea with such transparent enthusiasm that it became a running joke between Roy and Maggie. He took Maggie riding on the Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, saddling a calm mare from his stock for her, and they would ride the edges of his land with the vast New Mexico sky above them and talk. They talked about everything. That was the thing that surprised Roy, who had expected conversation to be laborious given that it had been 3 years since he had talked to anyone about anything beyond cattle prices and crop forecasts and Clara's schoolwork. But Maggie talked the way she taught, directly and with full attention, and she asked questions that were the right questions, the ones that opened doors rather than closing them, and he found himself saying things he had not said aloud since Ellen died. He told her about meeting Ellen at a county fair in Kansas when he was 22. He told her about the early years of their marriage when they had very little money and a great deal of stubbornness between them, which had sometimes made things harder than they needed to be. He told her about Ellen's final weeks and how Clara had been so small and so absolutely certain that her mother would be fine, because children that age do not fully understand that the people who love them can leave permanently. Maggie listened to all of it without trying to fix it or minimize it, which was the thing he had needed most without knowing it. She told him about herself too, with the same careful honesty. She had grown up in St. Louis, the middle daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died when she was 15, leaving her mother with 3 girls and not enough income. She had worked and studied both at once, earned her teaching certificate at 19, and spent 7 years teaching in a series of small towns in Kansas and Colorado before responding to Walsh's advertisement. Each town had been a fresh start, which was partly practical and partly, she admitted, a habit of self-protection she had developed so thoroughly it had begun to feel like preference. "Were you ever close to marrying?" Roy asked her once, on one of those Sunday rides, as they sat their horses on a rise overlooking his south pasture. She considered the question with her characteristic thoroughness. "Once," she said, "in Colorado, a man named Patterson, he was a good man, a farmer. He asked me and I said yes, and then 3 weeks later I said no." "Why?" She looked out across the brown grass and the thin line of the creek catching light. "Because I realized I had said yes mostly because it seemed like the natural next thing to do," she said. "And he deserved better than that, and so did I." Roy thought about that. "That took courage," he said, "to say no after saying yes." "It took about 10 different kinds of fear," she said, correcting him gently. "The courage part came later, when I stopped being ashamed of having broken an engagement and started being glad I had done it before rather than after." They rode back toward town in the comfortable quiet that had become one of his favorite things about being with her, the kind of silence that did not require filling. Clara, for her part, had responded to the news that Papa was courting Miss Norris with a calmness that was either the equanimity of a child who had expected this outcome all along, or the performance of a child who had expected this outcome all along and did not want to appear smug. She continued to set the chair every night. When Roy pointed out that Maggie was not going to materialize at their supper table on a random Tuesday evening just because the chair was there, Clara said that it was the principle of the thing. Roy did not press the point. There was something about that chair, he had come to understand, that was not really about logistics. It was Clara's way of holding space, of saying out loud, in the only language a 9-year-old has at her disposal, that their family had room in it. That whatever had been lost was not the whole of what they could be. He had started to think she might be right. The complication, when it arrived, came from a direction Roy had not anticipated. In December, a letter arrived from Ellen's mother, Harriet Vance, who lived in Wichita, Kansas. Harriet had been a distant but consistent presence in their lives since Ellen died, sending occasional gifts and letters to Clara, and maintaining a civil, if slightly strained, correspondence with Roy. He had always suspected that Harriet held him partially responsible for Ellen's death, in the way that grieving people sometimes hold anyone at hand partially responsible, and he had accepted that as the price of maintaining Clara's relationship with her grandmother. The letter was not a gift and was not particularly civil. Harriet had heard, through some network of correspondence Roy could only imagine, that Roy was courting a woman in New Mexico, and her letter made it clear that she found this premature and disrespectful to Ellen's memory, and furthermore that she was concerned about the effect on Clara, and she wondered if Roy might consider the possibility that Dusty Creek was not the right environment for her granddaughter, and that Clara might benefit from spending some time in Wichita under Harriet's supervision. Roy read the letter twice and put it away and did not immediately respond, which was a mistake because it allowed his anger to go cold and settle into something more calculated and therefore more dangerous. He told Maggie about it the following Saturday. They were in me's sitting room with the door open and me ostentatiously knitting in the kitchen, and Roy handed her the letter and watched her read it. When she looked up, her expression was careful. "How are you feeling about it?" she said. "Angry," he said, which was the most honest word he could find. "She is afraid of losing her connection to Clara," Maggie said. "That is what this is." "She is threatening to take my daughter," Roy said. "She is making a request that feels like a threat," Maggie corrected him gently. "They are different things. Has she any legal standing?" "None," Roy said. "Clara is mine and I am her only parent and I have done nothing wrong." "Then the anger is understandable, but the fear is not necessary," Maggie said. "What you do have to decide is what to do about the relationship with her grandmother, for Clara's sake." Roy looked at her. "You think I should respond charitably?" "I think you should respond honestly," she said. "And I think honest in this case means telling her that you have begun to see someone and that Clara is happy and healthy and loved, and that you would welcome her in Dusty Creek if she wants to know Clara better, and that the alternative you will not accept." He was quiet for a moment. "If you were not here," he said, "I would have written her a much shorter letter." "I know," she said with a slight smile. He wrote to Harriet. It was the hardest letter he had written since the letters informing people of Ellen's death. He was honest in it the way Maggie had asked, and he was clear about what he would and would not accept, and he extended the invitation to visit with a genuineness that surprised him when he read it back. He sealed it and sent it before he could revise himself into something colder. Harriet's response took 3 weeks and arrived in January. It was shorter than her first letter. She said she was glad Clara was healthy. She said she was grateful for the invitation. She said she would consider it. It was not warm, but it was not threatening, and Roy recognized it for the retreat it was and accepted it. Clara, when Roy told her that her grandmother was thinking of visiting, went very still in the way she did when processing large information. Then she said, "Will she sit in the chair?" "Which chair?" Roy said, though he knew. "Miss Norris's chair," Clara said. "Miss Norris's chair," Roy repeated carefully and heard himself say it. Clara looked at him with those storm cloud eyes. "That is what it is," she said simply. He thought he should probably make a decision about that particular fact sooner rather than later. It was January of 1883, and the desert cold had a particular quality in New Mexico that was different from the damp cold of Kansas, cleaner but fiercer, and the nights were long and very dark except when the moon was up. And on those nights, the land outside Dusty Creek shone silver and looked like a painting of itself. Roy had been thinking about the ring for 2 months. He was aware of the tradition, and he was aware of what it meant, and he was also aware that he was afraid of it in a way he had not expected to be afraid of anything at his age. He was 34 years old. He had been a husband and a father and a widower and a cattleman, and he had survived things that should probably have broken him. And yet the prospect of asking Maggie Norris to marry him tied his stomach in a knot that he found both undignified and inarguable. He told Dahlin about it one morning while they were mending a corral gate in the January cold, because he needed to tell someone and Dahlin was the least likely to make anything complicated of it. Dahlin said, "What is stopping you?" Roy thought about it honestly. "Fear," he said. "Of what?" Dahlin said. "Of being wrong again," Roy said. "Not wrong about her, wrong in the timing, wrong in some way I cannot predict." Dahlin hammered a nail into the new board. "I have known you 3 years," he said. "I have seen you make 100 decisions without blinking. You are afraid because this one matters more than the others." "That is an obvious thing to say," Roy said. "The obvious things are usually the true ones," Dolan said. Roy went into town that afternoon and spoke to Walsh, who ran the mercantile, and asked whether Walsh had any idea what kind of ring Maggie might prefer, since Walsh knew her almost as well as anyone in town. Walsh looked at him with an expression of barely contained delight and said he happened to know that Maggie admired simple things and disliked fussiness, and that she had once remarked that the most beautiful piece of jewelry she had ever seen was her grandmother's plain gold band. Roy ordered a plain gold band from the jeweler in Santa Fe through the post, which meant he would have to wait 3 weeks for it to arrive, which felt like approximately 3 years. In the meantime, he managed to be so obviously distracted that Clara noticed, and one evening at supper, she put her fork down and looked at him and said, "Papa, if you are going to ask her, you should just ask her." Roy stared at his daughter. "You do not know what I am thinking. You have been polishing your good boots twice a week," Clara said. "You only do that when something is important." He sent her to bed. She went satisfied. The ring arrived on a Thursday in early February, just before the supper hour. Roy was in town when Walsh handed him the small paper-wrapped package, and he stood on the boardwalk in the cold wind and unwrapped it and looked at it in the fading afternoon light. It was exactly right. Plain and bright and the right size, because he had wrapped a piece of yarn around Maggie's finger one Sunday afternoon on the pretext of measuring for riding gloves that did not actually exist, which Maggie had pretended to believe because she was both gracious and perceptive. He walked to Me's boarding house, which was 2 streets from the mercantile, and knocked on the door, and Me answered and immediately looked between his face and his coat pocket and said, "She is in the sitting room," with a velocity that suggested she had been waiting for this moment. Maggie was reading by the sitting room window, a book open on her lap, her hair down for the evening because she was in for the night, and it was the first time he had seen her hair down, and it was longer than he had realized, and she looked up when he came in and saw his face and put the book carefully on the table beside her. "Roy," she said. It was the first time she had used his name without the Mr. He did not know whether she realized she had done it. He sat down across from her and reached into his coat pocket and held the ring out in his palm in the plain direct way he did everything, without preamble or rehearsed speech, because he was not a man who trusted himself with rehearsed speeches, and she was not a woman who needed them. "Maggie," he said, "I am not a simple situation. I know that. I have a daughter who will have very strong opinions about everything you do forever. I have a ranch that takes most of my hours. I have a grief in my past that I have not fully finished with. I know all of that." He held her gaze. "But I also know that the most alive I have felt in 3 years is in the hours I spend with you. And I know that my daughter kept a chair empty at our table for the better part of 2 months because she already knew what I was too afraid to say." He stopped. "I love you, and I would like to marry you if you will have me." Maggie looked at the ring in his palm for a moment, and then she looked at his face, and whatever she was reading there seemed to be the same thing she had been hoping for, because she reached out and took the ring from his palm and turned it in her fingers and then held it out to him. "Put it on," she said. He slid it onto her finger. It fit exactly right. "I love you," she said, quietly and directly, in the manner of a woman who, having decided a thing, does not hedge it. "Yes." Me was not even pretending to be in the kitchen. She was in the doorway making an extremely poor job of appearing to be dusting the door frame, and when Roy looked at her, she put her arms in the air and said, "Finally." They were married in March of 1883 in the small church at the eastern end of Dusty Creek, which was Lutheran and slightly drafty, but had good light through its south-facing windows in the morning. It was not a large ceremony. Roy had Dahlan and Perfecto. Maggie had me and several of the school parents who had become genuine friends over the months. Walsh gave her away, which moved him more than he had anticipated, and which he covered with a great deal of throat clearing. Clara stood beside Roy in a new dress Me had helped her make, and she held Roy's hand during the vows and looked at Maggie with an expression that was entirely beyond her years, an expression of deep satisfaction and profound relief, as though she had been carrying a weight and had now been permitted to set it down. Roy spoke his vows in a clear voice without once looking away from Maggie's face, and Maggie spoke hers the same way. And when it was done and Roy kissed her, which was a thing he had been deeply careful not to do before this precise moment, out of a respect for propriety that Maggie had teased him about, Clara made a small sound of profound approval that made several of the adults laugh. Afterward there was a supper at Me's dining room, the room where the whole thing had effectively begun, and Clara sat between Roy and Maggie, and the chair at the end of the table, the chair that had been empty so many evenings, was now occupied by Walsh's eldest daughter who had come up from Albuquerque for the wedding. Clara looked at it once and then looked at Maggie and then looked back at her plate with a satisfied smile. The chair had done its work. Life on the Ralston ranch reorganized itself around Maggie with the ease of a thing that had always been waiting to happen. She kept teaching because the school needed her and she loved it, and she rode into town on school days and Roy rode in with her when he could, which was more often than not because he found he had an unscientific but absolute need to know she had arrived safely, given that the road between the ranch and town had 2 creek crossings that could run fast in March. Clara thrived in a way that was visible in her face, in the way her shoulders came down from around her ears, in the way she laughed more easily and slept more soundly. She called Maggie, Maggie by mutual agreement because Maggie had said that she would not ask Clara to call her anything. Clara did not wish to call her, and Clara had thought about it seriously for several days, and then said she thought Maggie was the right word, not because she did not love her, but because mother was a word that belonged to someone Clara still held carefully in her heart. Maggie had said she understood completely, and that Maggie was exactly right, and Clara had climbed into her arms with the sudden urgency of a child who has been formal for too long. The spring of 1883 was a good one. Roy's cattle came through the winter better than expected, and the spring calving went well. And Dahlan, who had been considering heading back to Texas for 2 years, decided to stay another season, which Roy took as confirmation that things at the Ralston spread were going in the right direction. Perfecto's wife Consuela came out from the village south of town and settled in the small house Roy had built for the hands, and suddenly the ranch was a community of sorts. And Saturday evenings there were often 5 or 6 people around a fire near the bunkhouse sharing food and conversation, in a mix of English and Spanish that Clara took to with an aptitude that delighted Maggie and confirmed Maggie's theory about her mathematical mind. It was May when Maggie told Roy she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen of the ranch house on a Sunday morning before Clara was up, sitting across from him at the table where he was drinking his first coffee of the day, and she said it simply and directly in the manner that was wholly hers, and he set his cup down very carefully. "Are you sure?" he said. "Yes," she said. He came around the table and pulled her up from her chair and held her in the morning light from the east window and did not say anything else for a long time, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. Clara's response, when told, was to say immediately, "Is it a boy or a girl?" "We will not know until it arrives," Maggie said. Clara considered this. "I would prefer a brother," she said. "I am already good at being a girl. It would be more interesting to learn about being a boy's sister." Roy and Maggie both laughed, and Roy thought he had never in his life been as warm inside as he was in that moment, standing in his own kitchen with his 2 best people. The summer progressed and Dusty Creek settled into its dry heat, and the school broke for the season, and Maggie spent the long July and August days at the ranch, helping Roy manage the household and reading and writing carefully and writing long letters to friends in Kansas and Colorado. She had written to her mother in St. Louis, and her mother had written back with a warmth that surprised Maggie, who had braced for concern. Her oldest sister had written asking if she might come for the birth, and Maggie had said yes immediately. Harriet Vance, Ellen's mother, came in August. Roy had been uncertain about the visit right up until the moment she stepped off the stage from Albuquerque, and he saw that she was an old woman who walked with a cane, and who looked at Clara with such naked love that he could not sustain his wariness. She was difficult, in the way people are difficult when they have loved too hard and lost too much, but she was not unkind, and Maggie handled her with a gentle matter-of-factness that Roy watched with absolute admiration. On Harriet's third evening at the ranch, he found her and Maggie sitting on the porch together in the long evening light, not talking, just sitting, and he stood in the doorway and watched them, and thought that Maggie was the kind of person who made peace not by demanding it, but by inhabiting it so thoroughly that everyone around her eventually moved toward it. Harriet went back to Wichita in September. Before she left, she held Maggie's hand for a moment at the stage and said, in a voice low enough that she probably thought Roy could not hear, "My daughter would have liked you." Maggie said, "I believe I would have liked her," and Harriet nodded once, the sharp, decisive nod of a woman who has made a peace she did not expect to make. Roy's son was born on a cold, clear night in November of 1883, 3 days before the anniversary of Roy and Maggie's first shared supper at Me's dining room, which everyone agreed was a satisfying kind of symmetry. He was a substantial, healthy baby with Roy's coloring and what would eventually prove to be Maggie's eyes, though they were too newly blue in those first days to tell for certain. Clara met him with the focused scientific attention she gave to all new information, studying his small hands and his sleeping face with great seriousness before pronouncing him acceptable. They named him Elliot James Ralston, James for Maggie's father. Elliot because Clara had found it in a story and said it sounded like the name of a person who would be interesting. Roy held his son in the lamplight of the bedroom while Maggie slept after the long hours of the birth, and he sat in the chair by the window and felt the weight of the small body in his arms and the quiet of the house and the presence of both his children under this roof. And he thought about the years since Ellen died, the gray and punishing years, and how he had worked and kept himself going with work, because work was the only thing he knew how to trust. He thought about a small girl pulling out a chair at the supper table and smoothing the cushion with her palms, setting a place for someone she had decided was important before she had any reason to be sure. He thought about the first time Maggie had sat in that chair, crossing the length of the dining room with her plate and her glass, and how even then, even in that first politely stilted supper, he had felt something shift back into alignment inside him that he had not known was misaligned. He thought about how courage, in his experience, was rarely the dramatic kind. It was usually Clara's kind. The quiet, patient, unreasonable insistence that there is still a place to be set, still a seat to be kept warm, still room at the table for something better. Elliot made a small sound in his sleep and curled his hand tighter around Roy's finger, and Roy pressed his lips to the top of his son's head and stayed very still. In the morning, Maggie was awake before him, which was typical of her, sitting up in bed with Elliot nursing, and a look on her face that was the most peaceful thing Roy had ever seen. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched their son. And outside the window the New Mexico sky was beginning its daily slow burn from black to purple to the first thin gold of dawn. "He is going to be trouble," Maggie said quietly. "All the best ones are," Roy said. She laughed, and Elliot startled and settled again, and Clara appeared in the doorway in her nightdress with her hair in a braid and said, "Is he awake? I want to show him something." "He is eating," Maggie said. "Come sit with us." Clara climbed onto the bed and arranged herself against Roy's other side, and the four of them were in the bed together in the early light, and Roy put his arm around his daughter and his wife sat against his shoulder and his son slept against his wife's chest, and he thought that this was the thing. Not the cattle or the land or the money, though those things mattered. Not the reputation or the work or the rebuilding of what had been lost. This. 4 people on a bed at dawn in a drafty ranch house in New Mexico in 1883, all of them breathing, all of them warm, all of them his. The next year brought change in the gradual way that years do, accumulating in small things that only reveal themselves as large when you stand at the far end and look back. Walsh sold the mercantile to a young couple from Kansas City and retired, which meant the school building changed hands, and for 2 uncomfortable weeks in the spring of 1884, there was uncertainty about whether the new owners would want to continue the school arrangement. Maggie handled this with characteristic directness by presenting herself to the new owners, Henry and Ruth Caldwell, with a complete accounting of the school's enrollment, schedule, and funding, and asking them what terms they required. Henry Caldwell turned out to be a man who understood the value of a functional school for property values if nothing else, and they reached an agreement within the hour. Maggie came home that evening and told Roy about it, and he said, "I never had any doubt," which was mostly true. Dolan did finally go back to Texas that spring, which Roy had known was coming for a year, and which he accepted with genuine sadness and genuine good wishes. He replaced him with a young man named Cesar, Consuela's younger brother, who was 17 but worked like someone twice his age, and had a natural way with horses that Roy recognized and respected. Perfecto and Consuela's first child, a daughter, arrived in May, and suddenly the ranch felt like an actual community in the way it had not quite been before. Roy expanded his grazing operation east along the creek in the summer of 1884, buying out a smaller rancher named Galt who was selling up and going to California. It was a good acquisition, solid land with good water access, and it doubled the size of the operation in a single transaction. He had the money for it because of 3 good years, and he made the decision carefully and on good terms with Galt, who shook his hand and said he was glad to sell to someone who would work it right. Maggie rode out with him the first morning after the papers were signed, and they walked their horses along the new eastern boundary in the September heat, and she said, "What will you do with all of this?" "Run more cattle," Roy said. "Build another line of pens on the east side. Maybe plant some hay on the south field if the water holds. And in 10 years, she said. He looked at her. She was beautiful in the morning light, her hair pinned up under her riding hat, Elliot at home with Consuela because he was just walking at 10 months and required constant supervision to prevent disaster. "In 10 years, he said, I hope to sit on that porch and watch my children run this land better than I did." She smiled. "Children, plural." "You have mentioned a possibility," he said carefully. "I have more than mentioned it," she said. He pulled his horse to a stop. "Maggie." "June," she said, with the calm of a woman delivering expected news. "Another one." He reached across the distance between their horses and took her hand. "A girl this time," he said, with a certainty he did not entirely have. "You do not know that," she said. "I have a feeling," he said. She looked at him with those amber eyes that had reordered his whole world, and she said, "Your feelings have a reasonable track record." His second child and first daughter was born in June of 1885, which was the hottest June Dusty Creek had seen in 5 years, and she came into the world in the full heat of a Tuesday afternoon with such determined ferocity that the midwife, a steady woman named Mrs. Archuleta, who had delivered half the children in the territory, said she had never attended a more emphatic entrance. They named her Ellen Mee Ralston. Ellen for Roy's first wife, because Maggie had been the one to suggest it and Roy had wept at the suggestion in a way he had not expected, the clean releasing kind of weeping that means something has been properly honored. Me for me Sutton, who had fed and housed and shepherded them through the entire courtship, and who received the news of the naming with such a profound silence that everyone in the room understood it was the highest honor she had ever been paid. Clara, 14 and already carrying herself with the quiet authority she had always been moving toward, held baby Ellen with a practiced ease she had developed with Elliot and looked at her with the focused assessment she gave everything. "She looks angry," Clara said. "She is not angry," Roy said. "She just arrived." "She looks like she arrived on purpose," Clara said, which was so accurate a description that Maggie laughed until she had to stop herself for the sake of her still sore midsection. The years that followed were the years Roy would think of, later, as the deep years. The years when the thing they had built together had roots deep enough that it did not shake in ordinary weather. Elliot grew from an emphatic baby into a genuinely interesting boy, curious and physical, who spent most of his waking hours either reading books Maggie provided or attempting to follow Roy around the ranch, absorbing everything. Ellen grew from an emphatic infant into an emphatic toddler, and then child who had Roy's stubbornness and Maggie's intelligence and her own particular personality that seemed to have very little to do with either of them. Fierce and funny, and completely unintimidated by anything. Clara finished her schooling and spent 2 years helping Maggie in the classroom before the thing they had all seen coming finally arrived in the form of a letter of acceptance to a teacher's college in Denver. Roy drove her to the stage himself and stood at the roadside while she climbed in, and she leaned out the window and gripped his hand and said, "You built something good, Papa." And he nodded because he could not trust himself to speak without embarrassing himself, and she squeezed his hand once and was gone. She wrote every 2 weeks with the precision of a person who takes obligations seriously. Long, detailed letters full of her observations about Denver and her courses and her fellow students and the wide, complicated world she was encountering. She wrote to Maggie separately, letters that Maggie read by the window in the evenings with a soft, private expression. And if those letters contained things she did not share with Roy, he did not ask, because there are conversations between women that belong to their own territory. Maggie kept teaching in Dusty Creek for 11 years in total, until 1893, when the school had grown enough to require a second teacher, and the town had grown enough to build a proper school building, and the Caldwells had sold to a town council, and everything had become municipal in the way things did when a town decided it might actually survive. She stepped back from full-time teaching then, not because she was forced to, but because she chose to, because Elliot was 9 and Ellen was 7, and there were things she wanted to teach them that could not be done in a schoolroom. She continued to be consulted by every new teacher who came through Dusty Creek for the next decade. She was not the kind of woman whose knowledge stayed in one room. Roy's ranch became one of the 3 largest operations in the county by 1890, not through ambition so much as through consistent good judgment and hard work, and the particular advantage of having made good early decisions about land and water. He was not a wealthy man by Eastern standards, but by New Mexico standards he had built something solid and lasting, and he knew it and was neither falsely modest about it nor particularly proud. It was work, good work, consistently done. In 1891, Clara came home from Denver a qualified teacher, 21 years old, and carrying herself with an assurance that was entirely her own. And she spent one last summer at the ranch before taking a position in Santa Fe. She and Maggie spent long evenings on the porch in conversation that went on past dark, and Roy would bring them coffee and sit with them, and listen to his daughter and his wife talk about books and ideas and the nature of good teaching. And the warmth he felt was so large it was almost unbearable, in the best possible way. On the last evening before Clara left for Santa Fe, they sat at supper together, the 5 of them, Roy and Maggie and Clara and Elliot and little Ellen, in the ranch house dining room with the good lanterns lit and Miss Sutton's grandmother's recipe for chicken and dumplings on the table because Clara had requested it. The table was full. Every chair was occupied. Elliot was describing with great technical enthusiasm something he had observed about cattle breeding that he felt warranted discussion, and Ellen was drawing something on the back of a piece of paper with a pencil she had found in her pocket, and Clara was listening to Elliot with genuine interest while simultaneously stealing a look at Roy that said she knew exactly what she was doing. Roy looked around his table. He looked at Maggie, who caught his eye across the noise and the food and the lamplight and gave him a look that said she saw it too, all of it, the same as he did. He thought about a night in the autumn of 1882 when he had stood in the doorway of a different dining room in a different building and seen an empty chair that his daughter had placed and smoothed and set like a promise. He thought about how he had not understood then what Clara understood with the absolute confidence of a child who knows that love, properly tended, does not diminish what was. It only adds to it. He thought about all the evenings Maggie had sat in that chair, and how gradually it had ceased to be a chair in a dining room and become something more than that, a presence, a place, a belonging. He reached under the table and found Maggie's hand and held it, and she squeezed his fingers without looking away from the children, and he understood that this was what the chair had always been about. Not an empty space, a space being held. After supper, Clara helped with the dishes, which she had not been asked to do, and then she came and found Roy on the porch in the dark with his coffee, and she sat beside him in the other chair the way she had sat beside him since she could walk, and they looked out at the land together for a while. "Are you happy?" Clara said. Roy looked at the stars, which were enormous and close in the New Mexico dark, and thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said. "Are you?" Clara leaned her head against his shoulder the way she had when she was 3 and 4 and 5 and he had read to her before bed. "Getting there," she said. "I am working on it." He put his arm around her. "You always were good at work," he said. She laughed, the real one, the one she got from her mother, and Roy closed his eyes for a moment and felt the night air and the warmth of his daughter beside him, and the sound of Maggie's voice from inside the house telling Elliot to stop tormenting his sister. And he thought he had not in his life imagined a moment as full as this one, and he had not deserved it, and it had happened anyway. That was, he thought, the most he could say about grace. Clara left the next morning with the stage and a considerable amount of luggage and Elliot's earnest prediction that Santa Fe was probably not as interesting as he had read. She waved from the window as the stage pulled away and Roy and Maggie stood in the road in the early light and watched it go, and Maggie slipped her hand into his and said nothing, and there was nothing to say. They were 50 yards down the road walking back toward the ranch before either of them spoke, and it was Roy who spoke first. "She is going to be remarkable," he said. "She already is," Maggie said. He looked at her in the morning light, at the lines that had settled into the corners of her eyes and the gray that had begun threading through her dark hair over the past year, and he thought she was more beautiful now than she had been in Walsh's schoolroom with the map on the wall, which had seemed impossible then and was entirely true now. "Maggie," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am glad," he said. "About all of it." She stopped walking and turned to look at him with those amber eyes, and she smiled in the way she had smiled the night he had asked her to marry him, the full one, the one that rearranged things. "So am I," she said. "So am I, Roy." They walked back to the ranch together in the morning light, and behind them the stage dust settled on the road, and ahead of them Elliot and Ellen could be heard through the open kitchen window, already generating some controversy that would require adult intervention. And the sun was coming up gold over the mesa, and the day was beginning. The full, warm, ordinary, extraordinary day. Supper that evening was the 4 of them, Roy and Maggie and their 2 children, noisy and full of food, and the particular bright chaos of a family that is deeply itself. Roy looked at the table and thought of Clara somewhere on the road to Santa Fe with her future ahead of her, and thought of Harriet Vance in Wichita, who had written last Christmas that she was coming for a visit in the spring, and thought of Miss Sutton, who had retired her dish towel and her boarding house the previous year, and now lived with her niece in town, and came for Sunday supper at the ranch at least twice a month. He thought of a dining room in the autumn of 1882, and a 9-year-old girl who had kept a chair empty, with a certainty that outpaced anything Roy had been capable of at the time. He poured water for Elliot and cut Ellen's meat into pieces because she was still at the age where she required assistance without wanting to admit it, and he looked across the table at Maggie, who was explaining to Elliot the difference between observation and conclusion in a way that was clearly going to become a longer conversation, and she met his eyes for a moment above their son's head. There was a whole language in it. There was, "I see you." There was, "I am here." There was, "This is ours, and it is enough, and it is more than enough. It is the entire world." Roy Ralston, who had spent 3 years building walls against exactly this, and another 2 tearing them down one careful stone at a time, and all the years after learning to live without the walls, looked at his wife across the supper table in the lamplight of his ranch house in New Mexico in the year 1891, and felt the particular peace of a man who has found out that the best things in his life were the things he had not known to hope for. Somewhere in Dusty Creek, in a dining room that had changed hands twice since the autumn of 1882, there was a table with a long row of chairs. One of them, worn slightly more than the others at the cushion, had once been kept empty by a small girl who believed in making room. It was empty no longer. It had not been empty for a very long time. And every night, at the Ralston Ranch table north of town, every chair was taken, and the food was good, and the voices overlapped in the particular harmonic chaos of people who are entirely at home with one another, and the lantern light was warm, and outside the window the New Mexico stars were rising one by one into their places, patient and bright and perfectly arranged, each one exactly where it was always meant to be.